Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're diving into something pretty significant today, Chapter 3 of the Quran, the House of ʿImrān. It looks like from your notes, we're aiming for a solid scholarly understanding of this chapter.
That's right. We're going to be touching on all the key aspects of this chapter. It's known for its depth and complexity. I mean, it covers a pretty wide range of things.
Right.
Theological discussions, historical evidence, and social commentary. It's really a fascinating window into the early Islamic period.
Yeah, it sounds like it. All right, well, let's jump right in. One thing that struck me was, from your notes, was how much the chapter emphasizes the Quran itself. It's like it's acting as a self-commentary in a way.
Yes. The House of ʿImrān definitely doesn't shy away from discussing its own nature and how it should be interpreted. Verse 7, for instance, brings up the concepts of muhkam verses and mutashabi verses. Muhkam verses have clear and unambiguous meanings, while mutashabi verses are open to multiple interpretations.
Okay.
They're often symbolic or allegorical.
So it's like the Quran is providing its own guide to understanding itself.
Exactly.
I imagine that had a big impact on how Islamic scholarship developed over time.
It absolutely did. This distinction between muhkam and mutashabi sparked centuries of debate amongst scholars. Some argued that only God truly knows the meaning of the mutashabi verses, while others felt that those with deep knowledge and spiritual insight could unveil those layers of meaning.
Interesting. So it's encouraging a multi-layered kind of reading.
Exactly.
You also noted that the chapter highlights the relationship between the Quran and the scriptures that came before it.
Yes. Chapter 3 makes it clear that the Quran confirms the truth of earlier revelations, like the Torah and the Gospel. Verses 3 and 84 both touch on this. They emphasize a shared lineage, but they also hint at potential differences in interpretation.
Okay, so it's acknowledging a connection to these Abrahamic faiths, but also asserting its own distinct role.
Precisely, and this sets the stage for a lot of the interfaith dialogue that has happened throughout history.
Now, speaking of earlier scriptures, Chapter 3 delves pretty deeply into the stories of some major figures, especially Mary, the mother of Jesus.
Yes, her story is given quite a bit of space in this chapter. It starts from her dedication to the temple as a child, all the way to the miraculous birth of Jesus.
Verse 35 actually describes her being chosen above all women of all the worlds. What significance does that hold?
It highlights Mary's piety, purity, and her elevated status. It emphasizes her role as a chosen vessel for God's will and foreshadows the extraordinary events that will unfold in her life.
And she's the only woman actually named in the Quran.
Exactly. That alone speaks to the importance of her story within the Islamic tradition. It's not just about Mary herself. It's about trusting in God's plan, even when it seems impossible.
Yeah, verse 37, for example, describes how Mary is miraculously provided for in the sanctuary. She receives sustenance directly from God, which ties into that idea of trust that you were just mentioning.
Yeah, absolutely. Her story is presented as an example of complete submission to God's will, even when faced with extraordinary circumstances.
Okay, so we've got this deep exploration of Mary's journey, but Chapter 3 also spends a lot of time on Jesus himself.
It does, and the language used is very specific. Verse 45 calls Jesus the Messiah, the Word from God, and a Spirit from him.
Those are some powerful titles. Who seems to be affirming his significance as a prophet.
Absolutely. But it's also important to note how it's framed within Islamic theology. The Quran consistently emphasizes that Jesus, while miraculous in his birth and mission, is still a creation of God, not divine himself.
Okay, that's a key distinction from how Christians understand Jesus.
Yes.
It's something that's likely to come up in interfaith discussions a lot.
You're right. It's a point of both connection and divergence, acknowledging a shared prophetic lineage, but also asserting distinct theological interpretations.
Now, aside from Mary and Jesus, another figure who comes up repeatedly in Chapter 3 is Abraham.
Yes. Abraham is central to all of the Abrahamic religions, and this chapter really emphasizes that. Verse 67, for instance, states that Abraham was neither a Jew nor a Christian, but a thanif, a submitter to God.
It seems like the chapter is trying to highlight this kind of primordial monotheism.
Yes.
Predating the formalization of those faiths.
Exactly. And it links that original submission to the message of Islam, presenting it as a continuation and restoration of that pure faith.
Okay, verse 95 also mentions the Kaaba in Mecca, the holiest site in Islam, as being the first house appointed for mankind, built by Abraham and Ishmael.
Right. This links Abraham directly to Islamic tradition, solidifying his place not just as a historical figure, but as someone whose legacy is woven into the very fabric of the faith.
So far, we've mostly been talking about the theological side of Chapter 3, but from your notes, I know that it also covers some key events in the early Muslim community, particularly the Battle of Uhud.
That's right. This battle was a really significant event, and the chapter doesn't shy away from depicting both the triumphs and the failures of the Muslims during this time.
Verse 121 talks about the believers preparing for battle with the prophet assigning positions. It's a very vivid scene, drawing the reader into that historical moment.
And it sets the stage for the emotional roller coaster that follows. Verse 153 describes a moment where some believers fled in the face of danger. It highlights that human element, even within this divinely inspired community.
Yeah, it's not just about the events themselves, but also about exploring those complexities of faith and human behavior under pressure.
Exactly. And it leads to some profound reflections on the nature of trust, obedience, and learning from mistakes. Verse 165, for example, directly attributes a defeat to the Muslims themselves, prompting introspection and self-accountability.
So it's not just about winning or losing battles, but about these deeper lessons, about the nature of struggle, both internal and external.
You got it. And that struggle isn't limited to the battlefield either. Chapter 3 also tackles the issue of hypocrisy within the community.
Oh yes, verse 167 describes those who claim belief, but whose hearts are filled with doubt and deceit. It's a pretty stark warning against insincerity.
Right. It's about that dissonance between outward actions and inward beliefs. The chapter calls for genuine faith, for aligning your deeds with what you say you believe.
It seems like Chapter 3 is really pushing for this active, engaged kind of faith, one that's about more than just words.
Absolutely. And that action extends beyond personal piety to social responsibility as well.
You're talking about verse 104, right? The one about enjoining right, forbidding wrong, and believing in God.
That's the one. It's about taking your faith into the world and striving to make it a better place, not just sitting back and being pious in private. And it's not limited to just Muslims either.
Right.
Verse 110 acknowledges the existence of an upright community amongst the people of the book.
That's interesting how Chapter 3 acknowledges both the need for unity within the Muslim community and the potential for righteousness among those of other faiths.
Yes, it speaks to a nuanced understanding of religious difference, one that recognizes both the distinctions and the common ground that can exist.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the Quran's self-commentary, its relationship to earlier scriptures, the stories of Mary and Jesus, the importance of Abraham, the Battle of Uhud, hypocrisy, and the call to social action.
Yeah, we've only just scratched the surface.
Wow. It sounds like we need to buckle up for the rest of this deep dive.
Yeah.
This chapter is packed with insights and definitely encourages us to think deeply about a wide range of topics.
It really does. There's so much more to uncover in this chapter. One thing that stood out to me was the recurring theme of God's attributes, particularly his absolute knowledge and power.
Yes, that definitely stood out to me too. There are several verses that really drive this point home.
For example, verse 5 states that nothing is hidden from God on earth or in heaven. It's a powerful declaration of his omniscience, knowing everything that happens, both outwardly and within our hearts.
It makes you think twice about those little thoughts and intentions we think are hidden.
Right.
It really emphasizes accountability and encourages sincerity.
Exactly. And this links to another key attribute, God's creative power. Verse 6 states that he it is who shapes you in the wombs as he pleases.
It's a reminder that we are ultimately creations of God, formed by his will from the very beginning.
Exactly. And it ties into that recurring theme of trusting in God's plan even when we don't fully understand it. It's about recognizing his wisdom and power in all aspects of creation, including our own existence.
So we've got God's absolute knowledge, his creative power, and then there's also a strong emphasis on his control over life and death.
Yes, that's a major theme throughout the Quran, and it's particularly prominent in chapter 3, verse 145, for example, states that no soul can die except by God's leave at a term appointed.
It's a reminder that our lifespan is predetermined, and we should live with an awareness of that. It's not meant to be morbid, but rather encourage us to make the most of our time and focus on what truly matters.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our ultimate destiny lies with God, and our focus should be on seeking his favor and preparing for the hereafter, which leads us to another major theme, the afterlife itself.
Yes. Chapter 3 has some pretty vivid descriptions of both paradise and hell. It uses really powerful imagery to depict the consequences of our actions in this life.
Verse 198, for example, talks about the righteous entering gardens beneath which rivers flow, while verse 196 warns that those who disbelieve will have their abode in the fire.
It paints a stark contrast, urging readers to really seriously consider the path they choose and its eternal implications.
Right. It's not about scaring people into submission, but rather emphasizing the gravity of our choices and the lasting impact they have beyond this earthly existence.
So we've talked about God's attributes, life and death, and the afterlife. What other key themes did you pick up on?
Well, chapter 3 also delves into some pretty practical matters related to social and economic justice. Usury, for example, is explicitly condemned in verse 130.
Right. The Quran is very clear in its prohibition of devouring usury. It's seen as an exploitative practice that creates inequality and undermines social harmony.
Exactly. It goes hand in hand with the emphasis on charity and spending in the way of God, which is mentioned in verse 92. True piety, according to this verse, is demonstrated through our willingness to give from what we cherish most.
It's about detaching ourselves from material possessions and recognizing that true wealth lies in our connection with God and our contributions to the well-being of others.
Precisely. And this ties into another social theme that comes up, interfaith relations.
Yes, verse 64 is a powerful call for finding common ground between Muslims and the people of the book. It urges everyone to worship God alone and avoid taking each other as lords apart from him.
It's a call for understanding and cooperation based on that shared belief in one God, recognizing the potential for common ground while also acknowledging those doctrinal differences.
But there are also verses that seem to suggest a more cautious approach to relationships with non-Muslims, right?
Yes, verse 28, for instance, cautions against taking disbelievers as protectors or allies. This has been subject to much debate and interpretation.
It's important to approach such verses with sensitivity, understanding the historical context, and considering the potential for misinterpretations that could lead to prejudice or exclusion.
Absolutely. It's about seeking a balanced and nuanced understanding, one that promotes both the preservation of the Muslim community's identity and values and a respectful coexistence with those of other faiths.
So going back to the personal level for a moment, Chapter 3 also offers some really interesting insights into human psychology and behavior.
You're talking about verses like 120 and 188, right?
Exactly. The first one describes those consumed by envy, rejoicing in others' misfortunes, and being pained by their successes. The second one warns against boasting and seeking praise for deeds we haven't actually done.
Both verses highlight negative traits that can really poison our hearts and hinder our spiritual progress. They're reminders to focus on cultivating inner purity, gratitude, and sincerity, rather than being driven by ego and external validation.
It's like the chapter's prompting us to look inward, to examine our motivations and strive for genuine virtue, not just outward appearances.
Exactly. And this inner work is essential for navigating the challenges of life, particularly when we're facing hardship or opposition.
Speaking of challenges, Chapter 3 recounts the story of the Mubahala, that dramatic challenge to a prayer duel where both sides call on God's curse upon the liars. It's mentioned in verse 61.
Right. This event is seen as a testament to the prophet's truthfulness as his opponents refuse to participate, fearing those divine consequences.
It's a powerful story that reinforces that idea of divine support for the prophet and the ultimate triumph of truth.
It also emphasizes the importance of standing up for what you believe in, even in the face of opposition, trusting that God will ultimately guide and protect those who are sincere in their faith.
And that ties into the broader theme of trusting in God's plan, even when things are tough. Verse 175, for instance, encourages believers not to fear those who oppose them, but to fear God alone.
It's a powerful message of resilience and relying on that divine support, recognizing that true strength comes from aligning ourselves with God's will and seeking His guidance.
It's interesting how Chapter 3 manages to weave together these grand theological concepts with very practical guidance on navigating the challenges of everyday life, from our personal struggles to our social interactions, and even dealing with fear and adversity.
Exactly. And it's all presented within a framework of faith, emphasizing the importance of seeking God's pleasure, submitting to His will, and striving for a life of righteousness and virtue.
It sounds like we've covered a lot of ground in this section. We've covered so much ground already. But we are moving toward the end of Chapter 3. What else should we highlight before we wrap things up?
You're right. We have covered a lot, but there are a few more gems worth exploring. One thing that I noticed in your notes was the emphasis on sincere supplication and recognizing our own fallibility.
Right.
Verse 193 in particular offers a beautiful example of this.
Oh, yeah, the verse where they say, "Our Lord, We have believed in what thou hast revealed and followed the messenger. So write us down among those who bear witness. Those who have attained knowledge, they're pleading.
Exactly. It's a powerful image of humility and recognizing our reliance on God's mercy. Even those who have achieved a high level of spiritual understanding are still in need of God's forgiveness and guidance. Spiritual growth is an ongoing journey. We're all susceptible to mistakes and shortcomings.
Yeah, definitely a message that resonates across different spiritual traditions. The importance of humility and recognizing our limitations before the divine.
Absolutely. And it ties into another key theme in Chapter 3, the importance of patience and perseverance, especially when facing challenges or adversity.
There are a number of verses that touch on this, right?
Yes, quite a few. Verse 175, for example, encourages believers not to be swayed by the apparent prosperity or freedom of those who disbelieve. It reminds them that worldly enjoyment is fleeting, while the ultimate refuge for the disbelievers is hell.
So it's about keeping our priorities straight and not getting distracted by worldly pursuits, focusing on what truly matters.
Exactly. Our relationship with God and our preparation for the hereafter.
Right, and not fearing those who oppose us, but fearing God alone.
Exactly. True strength comes from trusting in divine support and guidance, not from worldly power or alliances.
There's also verse 200, which encourages steadfastness and patience in the face of adversity. It assures believers that God is with those who patiently persevere.
Now, before we go on to the last part of our deep dive, I want to touch on one more passage I find really thought-provoking. It's a section where God speaks directly to the people of the book, asking them why they reject his signs.
Okay, I'm curious. What's the context for this?
It's probably addressing the rejection of the Prophet Muhammad's message by some Jews and Christians. Remember, the Quran claims to continue and confirm earlier revelations, so this rejection is seen as a denial of God's truth.
So it's not just about having different beliefs. It's about a perceived refusal to acknowledge the truth, even when it's right there.
Exactly. And it highlights how important genuine inquiry and open-mindedness are when encountering different faiths. It's a call to examine our own biases and engage in dialogue humbly and respectfully.
Like saying, don't just dismiss something because it's different. Really try to understand it.
Exactly. And this ties back to the Quran's emphasis on knowledge and understanding. It encourages us to seek knowledge everywhere, to think about its meaning, and to use our intelligence to separate truth from falsehood. Now, let's move on to the last part of our discussion on the House of Imran. So, Chapter 3 really pushes this idea of always learning and growing spiritually. It reminds us that our faith journey isn't about blindly accepting things, but about really understanding our beliefs, seeking deeper meaning, and refining our perspective as we go through life.
It reminds me that true knowledge needs humility, an open mind, and a willingness to question our own assumptions. It's realizing we don't have all the answers, and there's always more to learn and discover.
Exactly. And speaking of discovery, there's another passage in this chapter I find intriguing. It describes the criterion, a test or standard used to judge people on Judgment Day.
Oh, that sounds important. What exactly is this criterion, and how does it fit into our understanding of judgment and accountability?
The Quran doesn't give specifics about what the criterion is, but it highlights its importance in deciding our fate. It suggests our actions, beliefs, and choices will be measured against this divine standard. It reminds us that we're accountable for what we do and that our intentions really matter.
It's a sobering thought, but also a powerful motivator to live in line with God's will and guidance.
Definitely. Now, switching gears a bit, another aspect of Chapter 3 I want to touch on is the emphasis on God's attributes and qualities. This chapter is full of descriptions of God's mercy, forgiveness, wisdom, and power. It reminds us that how we see God shapes our relationship with him and affects our actions and choices.
It's like getting a glimpse into God's heart, right?
Yeah.
It reminds us that he's not some distant being, but a God involved in our lives who cares for us, guides us, and offers us boundless love and compassion.
Beautifully said.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive into the House of Imrān, stories of prophets, theological concepts, the challenges and triumphs of the early Muslim community. What are the most important takeaways from this chapter for you?
For me, it's the focus on always seeking knowledge, developing a deeper understanding of our faith. It's about engaging with the Quran's wisdom, wrestling with its complexity, and letting its teachings change our hearts and minds.
I couldn't agree more. This chapter challenges us to go beyond surface-level interpretations, to dive into the depths of its meaning and come away with a renewed sense of purpose. And for everyone listening, what resonated with you during this deep dive? What ideas or insights will you take with you as you continue exploring the House of Imrān? Remember, understanding is a journey, a process that takes patience, humility, and a genuine desire for truth and guidance. It's a journey that can bring us closer to our faith and help us live more fulfilling and meaningful lives.
Beautifully said.